What is going on, everyone? Welcome to the ever-evolving, never-ending Ready, Set podcast. If society's a joke, then we're just here for the first set. All right. So we're going to talk about the rule changes in Major League Baseball this year. I know I don't really talk baseball too often. I know I talk about the Cubs here and there, but we don't really talk baseball. But believe it or not, I'm a football, baseball guy. There's not a lot of us out here. I mean, you can even say a little hockey, but hockey is just not. I can do playoff hockey, which that's why I don't really say I'm a hockey guy, because even playoff hockey nowadays, it's hard to get into it. I'm just in there if the Blackhawks are, I guess. But anyway, I love football, love baseball, and it's the football, baseball guy you don't really see too often, but here I am.
I'm not an orgy guy!
So, obviously, Major League Baseball is going through a big change. You could almost say we're entering a whole new era in baseball now, which we'll kind of break into that in a little bit. So I wanted to kind of talk about that. But before we get into what the rule changes are, I thought it would probably be a good idea to go back and look at the history of strikes, balls and strikes. So let's talk about the beginnings of baseball. You know, it's a pre-Civil War game. There were guys that claimed, I think there was a commission that got together and said that, I think it was Abner Doubleday was the guy that officially came up with baseball. And there's a bunch of people that say, hey, that's not entirely true, but they could at least agree, like, hey, this is the story that we can at least agree on the beginnings of what baseball was. And then I think in like the 1840s, 1845, I want to say, there was the 1840s, there were two clubs, and that they ended up splitting. And one of them that split out, essentially, I think they're the Knickerbockers. They basically came up with the standard rules of baseball that we know today. They basically created a bunch of, like, the framework of the game that we know today, but it wasn't exactly what it is today. Obviously, things evolve in time. And the only mention of balls and strikes in this, articles of conventions of baseball, if you will, was that in Article 9, there was only rules set for a pitcher, and it simply said the ball must be pitched, not thrown for the bats. Now, there were no called strikes. You could still strike out after 3 strikes if you swung and missed at 3 pitches. You weren't even punished. The idea back then, when in the pre-Civil War days, was just get the ball over the plate. And think about it like they were just throwing batting practice, basically. And I think also back then, you could call for a high pitch or a low pitch, which I remember that used to be the case in schoolyard ball. You call for upper hand, lower, all that stuff. Now, here's the thing. If you did swing 3 times and miss, it was quite embarrassing because the idea was the pitcher was throwing to you so the ball would be put in play. Again, the emphasis was on the batter hitting the ball into play so the game could be played that way. This whole pitcher versus batter thing, it wasn't really like a thing. It was just more like, dude, you can't hit the fucking ball. So with no concept of strike zone, batters could be really picky and avoid hittable pitches for as long as they want, because again, they weren't punished for not swinging the bat, and the pitchers weren't punished for throwing balls as well. And this created what you would call a pace problem, which you're going to kind of see that as a running theme here. Yeah, I mean, think about it. Like, there's no balls, there's no strikes. The only kind of strikes there are is if you swing the bat, and you can imagine this would create very long at-bats. I mean, you think people were complaining a year ago. Can you imagine if, there weren't even balls and strikes at that point? It's, again, pace problems. Okay, so in 1858, called strikes were implemented with one caveat. Batters would receive 1 warning call for the first hittable pitch they let pass. So in other words, if they just sat back and let the pitcher pitch and they got it over the plate or a hittable pitch, considered a strike. So effectively, it would require 4 strikes to make an out, which I find that very interesting because it wasn't 3 strikes you're out. I guess it was you got that 3rd strike, and then if another one was pitched and you missed that one, that was considered an out. So even with the called strikes, the game was still slow. It didn't take long for pitchers actually to realize that without any penalty for, not pitching a hittable ball, they could just bore the fucking batters to death by just, pitching outside, and it would get to the point where the batters were so bored that they would just give up.
Why don't you just give up?
And then essentially, that kind of reminds me of how we used to play video games, in the 90s and 2000s, where you would pitch the ball and you'd hold the D-pad to the left and it would just, pitch a ball way outside, and then you kind of get everyone used to like that outside pitch, and then you throw one inside. It's kind of the same thing there, except there were no balls. There was just strikes, And yeah, you could see, again, pace problem, because now you're probably spending 20 to 30 pitches to get one batter out. Historian John Thorne described a game where pitchers would throw wide of the plate.
Vaughn into the windup in his first offering. Just a bit outside. He tried the corner.
For up to 15 minutes. Think about that. Again, people are complaining last year. I think you got a pitcher who's just throwing wide of the plate for 15 minutes.
Ball 4.
Just waiting for the batter to get impatient and swing and miss at some unhittable pitch.
Ball 8.
For an out. It wasn't unusual to see 40 to 50 pitches in a single at bat. That is crazy. Again, it really makes you think, like, you think we had pace problems up until recently, we'll get into the quick pitch thing in a second, but woo, you know what I mean? 50, 60 pitches a batter. That's like, they at least pitch 100 pitches in 7 innings now, or 5, depending on, how your matchups are going. So when you get to the Civil War or the Civil Post, I call it the Civil Post-Civil War era of baseball. And that is when about 1863, they start realizing, like, okay, we got an issue here, And the rules were changed again to speed things up. Again, pace of play. You seeing a theme here? So-called balls were implemented.
Vaughn into the windup in his first offering. Just a bit outside.
This was like the biggest change that was made in these 18, 20 years is now the pitchers were going to be penalized for throwing bad pitches.
Ball 4. Ball 8.
And again, kind of the overall thing, you have a bunch of people, the rules are implemented, and then they find ways to game the system, and then the system is going to evolve from that. It's true in sports, it's true in life, it's true in everything, So called balls are implemented. Does anyone want to guess how many balls it would take to walk a batter? Not 4.
Ball 4.
Not 5. Not 6. Not 7. Not
Ball 8.
9 balls was what got a walk. And I think a walk back then was considered a hit, not a batted ball like it is today. They don't even count it as an at-bat. Again, we'll get into that in just one quick second. So after 9 bad pitches, the batter would be awarded first base. But here's what's interesting. You got to think of the mentality of the time. The game's been around for, professionally at least for 20 years. The whole idea of the ball being pitched is to put it in place. So the mentality of, the old timers, if you will, at that is you don't take walks. You hit the ball. They're throwing the ball to you to be hit, ideally, so you want to put it in play. That is the mentality, the unwritten rule, if you will. And as one of the walks were considered cowardly. And one of the early stars of the game, George Wright, said in a 1915 interview with the New York Sun, it was unusual because it was an unwritten law that a hitter should do his utmost to connect with the ball, and he was not handicapped by any rule as to where he should step in order to hit. As a result, the league walk rate remained in the 1 to 3% throughout the 1870s. So that was kind of how baseball started. Like, hey, we'll give them 9 balls. We'll call it a day, And that was kind of how things were set up, through the next, what are we looking? 20, that was the 18. So for the next 7-8 years, that was kind of how they did it. They went with this 9 balls. So that walks us into what I'm going to call the National League, the Major League era, because I believe at this time is when the National League was formed, and they started kind of, this where you had the White Stockings, Cincinnati Reds, which is the oldest team in Major League Baseball. So when you get into the 1870s, the ball and strike rule remained unchanged for a while. It was until pitchers began taking matters into their own hands. Because again, remember, when you come up to bat in this time, you're saying, yo, pitch me up high. Pitch me low, whichever your preference is. And these guys, it was essentially just batting practice. It had to be a pitch. I don't know the difference between a pitch and a throw. Maybe that's the stance, the left. You give them the little wiggle the butt, throw. I'm just kidding here. But the idea was you were essentially in a glorified batting practice, and just the idea was you wanted the ball in play. But then what happened is through the 1870s, a lot of these guys who were pitching, they started figuring out how to, throw the ball with different arm angles, to spin it to get a specific, a curveball, a slider, all these kind of things. They wanted to take that part of the game, as more and turn it to more than just glorified batting practice. So they learned how to make all of these pitches, making it increasingly harder for all the batters to be able to hit the ball. And that resulted in a huge drop of offense. So now what you have MLB back in this day, they have a pace of play problem, and now they're having, zero offense. And as we know today, this is what the masses like. So here's the results. In 1871, teams were scoring more than 10 runs per game on average. In 1876, less than 6 runs per game on average. Okay, so now that's almost half, 40% less offense going on in these baseball games. In 1880, this is what their big move was. What was this? 17 years later, is we'll lower the threshold for a walk to 8 balls.
Ball 8.
Okay, thanks, I guess. In 1882, they dropped it to 7, and in 1884, they lowered it again to 6. So this really shows you what's going on. In 17 years, they didn't do anything about those rules, those pace of play, and as the pitchers got better, they started realizing the offense in Major League Baseball, in the National League, really, because the American League didn't exist yet, was dropping. And, this is problematic because people want to see offense. Again, we know this is in today's standards, especially true back then. And they did nothing for, those 13, 14 years. And then in a matter of 6 years, it goes from not even. I'm sorry. I'm wrong about that. In 1880, they lowered it to 8 balls. Within 4 years, 5 seasons even, it was lowered down to 6. Okay? So not only was the number of balls for a walk lowered to 5 in 1887, but the warning pitch strike was eliminated. The warning strike was eliminated, as was the rule allowing for a batter to call for a high pitch or a low pitch. And this is the first year that walks were counted as hit. Okay, so I was wrong earlier. This was the first year they started counting hits as walks as hits in the historical record. Okay, so let's break this down really quickly. They lower the number of balls from 6 to 5, and then they tell the batter, hey, there's no more strikes, because that's what the warning pitch was. It's essentially another name for a strike. No more strikes. So the pitcher has, if the pitcher can't get the ball over the plate 5 times, if they miss the plate 5 times, you get to take a base, and that's a hit, and there's no strikes against you. This is what you would call an overcorrection, And under this new onslaught of under these new rules, teams scored over 6 runs per game for the first time in history of the American Association. That's the American League, and for the first time in 1875 since the National League. So what happened was the American League had it in about 10 or so years. They started. We're a major league, but before that, before the American League became the American League, it was what is it called? The American Association, and I don't think it had declared themselves a major professional league yet, but that was definitely coming up. So in 1888, 3 strikes to an out, and walks were no longer hits. That was their big, because 1887 was a crazy year. I mean, you could see just in the jump of offense, they clearly had an overcorrection, and it wasn't really that great for the game. Again, those games probably would be really fun to watch. Think about it. If you're a pitcher, you hate it because you have a requirement on you. If you can't get the ball over the plate 5 times, the batter walks. And the batter has no strikes, so the only way to get the batter out is to get the ball in play, which means you're forced to put the ball over the plate, and the batter knows that ball is coming, so of course it was a hit fest, So in 1888, they 3 strikes to an out, and walks are no longer hits, because that's the other reason that 1887 year was kind of crazy. If you look at the stats, like there was just hits left and right, and a lot of that was because the walks were counted as hits, where now if you are walked, it's not an at-bat, and it's a bad ball, not a hit. All right, so then in 1889, the threshold for a walk was lowered to 4 balls.
Ball 4.
And the 3-strike, 4-ball standard would remain in place up through the current day. So we basically had the same 3-strike, 4-ball rule since 1889. Batting average and run scoring immediately rebounded to its previous levels. Now, here's where it's kind of interesting. Now, this is what a lot of people don't also know. up to this point, if you hit a foul ball in any of these situations, they weren't counted as strikes. They didn't change that until 1901 when the National League starts counting foul balls as strikes. Why am I talking about foul balls not counting as strikes? Have you ever heard of a guy named Cy Young, a pitcher? You know, they got this award that the AL and the NL hands out every year called the Cy Young Award. Okay. So this guy named Cy Young was probably one of the first hardest throwers ever in Major League Baseball. And he, I believe, has the most wins. I think it's like 500 something. The strikeout record was broken, but he was also the strikeout leader, if I'm remembering correctly, for the longest time. So he was doing this in an era where, he pitched for a long time. So he was doing this in an era where foul balls weren't counted as strikes. And this guy was still one of the most dominant pitchers in that era. Can you imagine a pitcher nowadays, if foul balls, it literally changes the game. It's so minute and small that you think, like, what's the big deal if there isn't a strike attached to a foul ball? Well, think about it. Have you seen these games where guys fall off like 10, 11 straight pitches? It caps it at 2 strikes, and then, you either have to, you know what I'm saying? A foul tip isn't an out unless it's a bunt, right? So think about you go 12 straight pitches with a guy, he fouls them all off, and the count's 2-0 still. Like, again, this is why Cy Young is kind of on a level than everyone else. And his stats, you really can't even compare his stats back then to today. Almost in the same way, you can't really compare what Michael Jordan was doing in the 90s to today because the game was different. NBA, you couldn't play zone defense back then. You couldn't hand check defend. The defender could. You could hand check people on defense. You see what I'm saying? Like, it's just a different game, and it kind of the same rules apply there for baseball. So the dead ball era was the other thing I wanted to kind of talk about, and what the dead ball era is it kind of means that the game was more of an inside game. It was all about getting hits, singles, triples, doubles. As I think in the Babe Ruth movie with John Goodman when he's playing for the Red Sox, they go, you hit him because he would hit a home run, which I don't even know if this is true, but the way the movie talked about it was he hit a home run, he goes back to the dugout, they're like, hey boy, what you doing there? We don't hit balls like that. You just hit them where they ain't. You just hit them in the gaps. And that's like crazy because that's only really a small part of the game nowadays, but back then that's what the game was, bunts, it was small ball. That's kind of what it was, an inside game of small ball, And the cost of baseballs back then were $3 a piece. I'm not talking about adjusted for inflation. I'm talking about 1901, it was $3 for a baseball, which is equivalent to $93 today. Can you imagine trying to operate a business and the thing that you need to operate costs almost, $100, in 1900s dollar money? That's crazy considering that you could buy something at the store for a penny back then, and a baseball was $3. So clearly, having that operating cost was a bit burdensome for some of these clubs because, again, Major League Baseball was basically, it was a startup back then. It was all about, there weren't TV contracts. The only money you made was at the gate or in merchandising, even if they did merchandising back then, because, again, the players were wearing the same jerseys over and over, so they weren't selling. I don't think they were merchandising. I think it was all about the money you made at the gate back then. So there wasn't a lot of revenue streams. You had maybe your advertisements and your gate receipts. Outside of that, not a lot of operating income coming in. And if you're paying today's dollars, almost $100 for a baseball, you're not going to, want people running off with those things. And that's exactly how it was done back then. So they would, if a foul ball, if a ball was hit into the stands, if it was hit into play, they would just keep using it. So it wasn't really out of the realm of possibility for a ball to be misshaped, blackened, dirt, mud, blackened from like tobacco juice, scuffed up, and they would just keep reusing these balls. And why that became so problematic was, as we know today, you have the batter's eye. Usually there's an area in center field where they don't seat anyone because it allows the batter to see the ball easier. And I don't think they really made that adjustment till in the last 50, 60 years. And, even nowadays, it's still hard to see a ball. And these things are pretty white and clean with an empty area behind it so the batter can see it easier. That wasn't the case back then. You're trying to play baseball in the middle of the day with crowds that are directly behind you that kind of, camouflages the ball. But then as the day goes on, the ball starts getting misshaped. It's scuffed. It's muddy. It's got tobacco juice on it. It has this elongated shape. So, it's going to probably turn through the air a lot differently. And, that's just how it was played. It's crazy to think. So the other thing was spitballs were pretty common in this era, where you could doctor the ball and throw it and, just kind of do what you have to do there. But the other thing was the games were very, very fast-paced. I mean, there were some games you'd be out of there in an hour and a half, 2 hours. That was kind of where baseball was doing really good. Again, outside of the fact that it was just, a very, very inside game, not really played beyond that. So that was the dead ball era. Okay, so is that everything? Okay, that's right. So then what happens is when you get to so the dead ball era basically ends in 1921 because, as I was saying before, these baseballs would be very hard to see because for all the reasons I just laid out. And what happened is a gentleman, because the ball was really hard to see, was hit in the head because he couldn't get out of the way fast enough. And he ultimately died, and I really wish I wrote that gentleman's name down, but I did not. And so Major League Baseball had to do something there. And what they decided to do was essentially outlaw the spitter and I think they started replenishing balls more frequently at this point, realizing that, baseball kind of discovered what the NFL discovered about 13 years ago with, the liabilities kind of in place. And, thank God we weren't that much of a litigious society back then because maybe there wouldn't be any baseball after that, And yeah, so that's kind of what happened with the history of balls and strikes. So how does that pertain to what's going on today? Well, as we know that Major League Baseball, now they're going to be what's called in the pitch clock era. Almost 100 years after the dead ball era and the spitter ends, here we are entering a whole new era into Major League Baseball, and we're going to talk about some of those rule changes right now. So here we go. So the rule changes for 2023. So now we have a pitch clock, a pitch timer. 15 seconds with bases empty, 20 seconds with runners on. However, the hitter gets one timeout per plate appearance, must be in the batter's box with 8 seconds left. And we're going to watch a video here with Max Scherzer with that. This is very interesting. I want to talk about that in a second. The pitchers get 2 disengagements, pickoff attempts or step-offs per batter. Violations are a balk. No, I think the last guy to steal 100 bases was Ricky Henderson back in 1989 of the Oakland A's. And I don't even think we've gotten anywhere near that number. And this is going to allow that number to grow because, think about it, baseball, for as long as I can remember it, you could get 6 pickoff attempts in a row. And a lot of that was the pitcher trying to hold the runner to the bag. But now the pitcher only gets 2 disengagements, a pickoff attempt or a step-off. So once he uses that, the runner knows he can't throw back over to me. Otherwise, I'm just going to be awarded the base based on a balk. So that's going to increase more. It's going to put more steals into the game, which can, add to offense. You could see the direction MLB is going here. And I'm not going to lie. When I first was looking at all this, I did not like it. But as I do more research, I think I'm liking what they're doing, especially when you have the context of history behind it. It's, not out of the – it seems like a big change because they haven't really made a change like this in, 100 years, maybe 50 years. The DH is different. So, yeah, we're going to go with 100 years. It's probably the first big change Major League Baseball has had since we left the dead ball era. Yeah, I like it. I don't have an issue with what they're doing here. I think it's – at first I did, but with the context of what they're doing before and what they're trying to do now, I actually kind of like what's happening here. So limits on pickoff attempts led to 26% increase in stolen bases, which is 1 out of 4, which isn't bad. 1 out of 4 attempts making it. And the pitch timer helped reduce game length by 25 minutes in the minors in 2022. So this is a big one I see is a lot of people are like, you're really changing the game to save 30 minutes. Yeah, well, I mean, if you were there back in the 1870s, I'm curious if you'd feel the same way now as you would then. Because chances are you probably don't want to watch a pitcher pitch one guy for 50 pitches straight. So to say, oh, well, you're changing the game for just 30 minutes, it's like, hey, man, you're just going to have to learn to accept change, bitch. It's that simple. All right. So then we have the shift restrictions. This has really been hampering lefties and lefty pull hitters because you could just move over, 5 guys to one side of the field, or so to speak. And and Major League Baseball is going to kind of get away with that, or get away from this. So the shift restrictions now are 2 infielders must be positioned on either side of second base when the pitch is released. All 4 infielders must have both feet within the infield when the pitcher is on the rubber. Shift restrictions increased batting average and decreased strikeouts in minors while giving players more opportunities to show off their athleticism. So in the past, what you would do, you just overload one side, dare that batter, or usually it was a left-handed batter, to go after this side of the field. That's why I say they were generally a pull hitter, right, left. Depending on which side they pulled to, that's what side they would shift to. Now there isn't. So this is going to be your defensive lineup, right now. There is one thing you can do as a defense if you want to bring in that 5th infielder, and that would be you could take the left field, the right field guy down and stick him in the infield. Now, however, by doing this, you're basically leaving a third of the outfield wide open for a bloop single to come in and kill you. You know what I mean? Maybe you'll see that situation, with 2 outs, no one on base, something like that, but that'll be definitely a risky move, and it'll be interesting to watch how a lot of teams defensively deal with this. Bigger bases. All right, so this, I didn't even know they were doing this. I kind of understand why they're doing it, but this diagram makes it look like, half the field is a base now. So they increased the bases from 15 inches square to 18 inches squared. Bigger bases are expected to have a positive impact on players' safety. Distance reduced by 3 feet from home to first and home to third, reduced by 4.5. Wait, that's inches, not feet. Wait, no, that's feet. From first to second and second to third. Interesting. So you don't have to throw as far now. I remember that first to third throw was always a bitch to make. That's why I could never play third base.
You play ball like a girl!
Even shortstop, I struggled with that one, but that's interesting, Again, this one seems to be more about player safety, not about, we know these guys can throw the ball. Like, you're not going to get in the majors if you can't throw the fucking ball. You know what I mean? Like, even if you can't bat and you can throw, they'll just turn you into a pitcher. But if you can't throw, you better hope you can hit, I guess, because you're pretty much useless after that. So that is all of the rule changes that we have here. And yeah, I'm kind of for this. I really, I really thought this is something I was going to be against, but I am totally for these rule changes in Major League Baseball. All right, so the question becomes, do we have any examples of these things being used, or of problems, we'll say, with these new rules? And yes is the answer to this question. So we're going to look at some videos here really quickly. This one is Max Scherzer is called for a balk after attempting a quick pitch in Victor Robles. Now, I didn't know this. I thought okay, well, this is going to be what the game eventually turns into, is you're just going to have to find a pitcher who's really good at quick pitching and so on and so forth. But what I found out was apparently the quick pitch is illegal. It just wasn't as enforced, up until today, because now the umpires are told you got to be really strict with this shit. And I guess the whole idea was the quick pitch was illegal for player safety because, you didn't want a batter kind of, halfway paying attention and then having a ball thrown at him. It's not safe, totally understandable. But the strategy behind what the pitcher is doing, it's kind of commendable. Let's watch that really quick.
The intra-squad games or these first couple of starts in spring training, he's
now watch
trying
the pitch
to figure
clock.
out how to best
We're up here.
utilize that pitch clock to his advantage.
He's trying to quick pitch now. So that made Robles step out.
So
that
he
means
stepped
Robles
out. He's
can't
allowed to
step
do that.
out the rest of the at-bat.
Right.
So that's his
There's
time.
quick
And now
pitch.
Scherzer
And there's
quick
balk.
pitches him, and that's a balk.
So you're not allowed to do that, which
The
is,
home plate umpire.
again, is kind of crazy because let's watch this again here. So we're going to go, where does he step out? Right here. Okay.
Robles step out.
So he steps
That
out of the
means
base.
Robles can't.
He steps out, so that's going to reset the pitch clock. But now, like you heard the announcer say, he can't step out. He is forced to hit this ball. Now, look what Scherzer does. He just, boom, 3
step out the
seconds
rest of the
pitch.
at-bat.
So that's his
Bam!
time. And now Scherzer
And
quick
you can't
pitches
do
him
that.
at-
And we're going to look at why here. Let me turn the volume down just a smidge. We're going to look at why. If you look at the batter as he gets back into the base, or into the batter's box, Yeah, so he's going to get back in the batter's box. The rules, if you read the rules, you have to be, it's like eyes up and paying attention. You have to be aware, I think is what it is. Now, the batter is not nearly aware, which is why this balk was called.
Robles stepped out.
Look, he's looking down, setting up.
That's his time, and now Scherzer
Can't do that.
pitches in,
So,
and that-
and this is, why this is what MLB came out and said the next day. They sent a memo to clubs last night clarifying that umpires will call a quick pitch if the pitcher delivers the ball before the batter is reasonably set. And reasonably set is reasonable. The batter's on the batter's box, timing the hitter's eye looking up. So that's what the standard was, and you can see Robles wasn't there. My eyesight sucks here. The rule has always been on the books for player safety, and the pitch clock doesn't change that. Penalty is a ball with the bases empty and a balk with runners on base. Okay. So you have to ask yourself, all right, so okay, we're having a little hiccups, Major League Baseball. And they said this is going to happen because this is what happened in the minors. A lot of these guys were just adjusting to these rules. And it's a bit of an adjustment, but I'll tell you what, when these rules start affecting the outcomes of the game, again, it's fine now because we know that this is just something that players are adjusting to. But what happens if something like this happens? Bases loaded, tie game, full count, and here's the pitch.
And now what?
He's out.
They have called strike 3. Wow! This is mayhem!
So they call strike 3 on the batter.
Automatic strike 3 called with the bases loaded in a tie game in the bottom of the 9th. This is baseball in 2023.
That it is. All I have to say to this is welcome to the pitch clock era.